German Shepherd barked nonstop at the abandoned car. What police discovered was beyond belief. In every corner of the world, there are stories of courage and love, stories where a dog's loyalty meets the strength of the human heart. What you're about to hear is one of them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story will stay with you long after it ends. The street was quiet that evening, too quiet for a town that usually carried the soft hum of life even after sunset. Dusk had settled in, painting the sky in faded shades of purple and gray, and a thin wind rustled through the bare trees. At the far edge of town, where the houses grew fewer and the streetlights flickered weakly, an old abandoned car sat crookedly against the curb. Its windows were clouded, its paint chipped down to rust, and weeds curled around its tires as if nature itself had decided to swallow it whole. For weeks, it had been there, ignored, forgotten, just another piece of junk blending into the silence. But not tonight. Tonight, the car was no longer forgotten. A German Shepherd stood stiffly in front of it, hackles raised, barking with a force that shook the quiet street. His voice cut through the evening like an alarm, each bark sharp and desperate. He lunged toward the car, claws scraping against the asphalt, then circled back, only to return with even greater intensity. His cries echoed against the empty houses, bouncing through the stillness until they became impossible to ignore. At first, people peeked through their curtains. A few stepped outside, coats pulled tight against the chill. They frowned at the dog, shook their heads, and muttered among themselves. "It's just a stray, maybe gone mad," one whispered. Another sighed, "Dogs bark at shadows. Pay it no mind." And one by one, they turned away, letting the shepherd's warning fade into the background of their own comfort. But the dog did not stop. He would not stop. His body trembled with urgency, his paws dragging against the ground as if trying to dig his way closer to the car's shadowy interior. His growl rumbled low and deep, then broke again into furious barking, louder than before. The sound was no longer just noise. It carried something raw, something unsettling, something that made the air feel heavier with each passing second. The abandoned car loomed darker in the fading light, its cracked windshield reflecting the last of the dying sun. To most, it was nothing more than metal and rust, but to the shepherd, it was something else. He knew. He felt it. Something hidden, something alive, something calling for him to keep going. The few townsfolk who lingered crossed their arms and muttered nervously. "Maybe it's a rat," one man suggested, though his voice wavered. "Or maybe something worse." Mothers pulled their children back inside, closing their doors a little quicker than usual. The street fell empty again, leaving only the sound of the wind and the dog's relentless barking. He barked until his throat grew hoarse, then barked again. His eyes never left the dark shape of the car, pupils wide, ears pinned back in focus. He pressed his nose to the door, sniffing, whining, then let out another desperate cry that carried not just urgency, but pain, as though he was pleading for someone, anyone, to understand. And in that moment, the question hung in the air like the heavy clouds above. Why this car? Why tonight? The dog's cries weren't madness. They weren't random. They were warnings. Something inside that rusted shell was waiting, something that would break hearts, shatter silence, and change the lives of everyone who dared to listen. The town didn't know it yet, but by ignoring the shepherd's voice, they were standing on the edge of a revelation they would never forget. The town of Millbrook was the kind of place where life moved slowly, almost predictably. Mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee drifting out of the corner cafe, where old men gathered to read the paper and share the same stories they had told for years. Afternoons carried the soft chatter of mothers on their porches, rocking in wooden chairs, waving at passers-by. Children played hopscotch on cracked sidewalks while their laughter echoed through the narrow streets. It was a quiet town, too quiet sometimes, But people liked it that way. In a world that seemed to be changing too fast, Millbrook clung to its calm rhythms like a precious heirloom. Everyone knew everyone here. Secrets didn't stay hidden for long. A single cough in the night, a light left on past midnight. Neighbors noticed, talked, and speculated. Gossip was the lifeblood of Millbrook. But even in a place where people prided themselves on knowing everything, there were still corners of mystery. Places and things no one wanted to talk about too loudly, as if whispering was safer. One of those mysteries sat at the far edge of town, beside a broken streetlight that hadn't worked in years. It wasn't an old building or a forgotten landmark, but something much simpler: a car. The car had appeared one evening as quietly as a shadow. No one saw who had parked it, no one admitted to seeing headlights glide through the street. It was just there one morning, an aging, rust-speckled sedan with one flat tire and windows coated in dust. At first, the townsfolk thought little of it. Maybe someone's old junk, maybe an out-of-towner who would come back for it. But days passed, then weeks, and still the car sat in the same spot, crooked against the curb as though abandoned in a hurry. The longer it stayed, the stranger it began to feel. The weeds around its tires grew thicker, curling up the rims like accusing fingers. Rust spread in dark veins across the doors. The cracked paint caught the sun in an unsettling way, making the car glimmer like a wound. And when the wind shifted, carrying air through the cracked streetlight pole, there was a faint smell around it. Something metallic, something sharp, something that didn't belong. At the cafe, people began to whisper about it. "Looks wrong, don't it?" one man said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Like it's hiding something." Another nodded, lowering his voice as though the car could hear. "A bad feeling, that's what it gives me. A car without an owner, that's no good sign." Women on their porches watched from a distance, pulling their shawls tighter as they spoke in hushed tones. Children dared each other to run up and touch it, but always turned back before getting too close. The strangest part was the window. While the rest of the car was sealed in grime, the rear passenger window was rolled down just a crack. Not enough to see inside, but just enough to suggest something. A detail so small most would overlook it, but in Millbrook, small things carried weight. "Why leave it open like that?" the whispers asked. "Who parks a car and never comes back for it?" At night, the car seemed even more unsettling. Its shadow stretched long across the cracked pavement, dark and heavy under the dim moonlight. Street lamps flickered as though uncertain about shining near it, and the wind seemed colder in that part of town. Passers-by walked quicker, keeping their eyes straight ahead, though they could feel it watching them from the corner of their vision. No one wanted to go near it, but no one wanted to admit why. It was easier to shrug and say, "It's just a car," even as unease spread like a quiet sickness. Deep down, the townsfolk knew something about it was wrong. The mayor once suggested towing it away, but the local mechanic shook his head. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered. "Could be nothing but trouble inside. Best to leave it." And so, like many things in Millbrook, the car was left alone. People noticed, people whispered, but no one acted. Until the German shepherd. At first, it was only small things. The dog would pause near the car on his walks, nose twitching, tail stiff. He would growl low, a warning sound, before moving on reluctantly. People brushed it off. Dogs bark at plenty of things, after all. But as the days passed, his behavior grew stranger. He began sitting by the car, refusing to move, his eyes locked on the dark windows as though he were waiting for something. And when he barked, loud, sharp, furious, his cries carried more weight than gossip ever could. His voice pierced the calm of Millbrook, shattering the illusion of safety the town wrapped around itself. He was trying to say something, trying to make them listen. The townsfolk didn't yet realize it, but that rusty old car was no longer just an eyesore. It was the beginning of a story that would change their quiet little town forever. Rex was no ordinary German shepherd. To the people of Millbrook, he was as much a part of the town as the church bell that rang every Sunday or the bakery that filled Main Street with the smell of fresh bread each morning. Strong, loyal, and sharp-eyed, Rex had been with his owner, Thomas Miller, for 6 years. Thomas was a retired carpenter, a quiet man in his late 60s who walked with a slight limp from years of heavy labor. Every evening, without fail, Thomas and Rex would walk the same route, circling through the heart of town before ending near the edge of the street where the abandoned car sat. At first, Rex would only slow his pace near the car. His ears would twitch, his nose flaring as though something unseen lingered in the air. Thomas noticed but thought little of it. Dogs were curious by nature. A smell, a sound too faint for human ears. These things could explain a shepherd's sudden pause. But soon, Rex's pauses turned into growls. Low, rumbling sounds that made Thomas grip the leash tighter. "Easy, boy," he would murmur, tugging gently. "Nothing there." Yet Rex's body would stiffen, his muscles coiled, his eyes locked on the rusting frame of the car as though it had suddenly come alive. Within days, Rex's behavior escalated. Passing the car was no longer a slow pause but a battle. He would lunge toward it, barking so fiercely that Thomas struggled to hold him back. The leash cut into Thomas's palm as the shepherd pulled with all his strength, desperate to reach the vehicle. His barks echoed through the street, sharp and relentless, carrying an urgency that unsettled anyone who heard them. "Rex, stop it!" Thomas scolded, his voice strained. But the dog refused to obey. He barked until his throat turned raw, his paws scraping at the pavement as if he could dig his way under the locked doors. When Thomas finally dragged him away, Rex would twist his head back, his eyes still locked on the car, whining with frustration. Neighbors began to notice. From porches and windows, they watched as Thomas struggled night after night with his once well-mannered companion. "That dog's gone strange," muttered old Mrs. Harper, clutching her shawl as she rocked in her chair. Others exchanged uneasy glances. "Dogs sense things we can't," one man whispered, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from fear. "Mark my words, something ain't right about that car." Despite their whispers, no one dared to act. They watched, they speculated, but like the car itself, they left the matter untouched. Thomas grew more troubled each day. He had raised Rex since he was a pup, trained him with patience and care. The dog was loyal to a fault, obedient to every command. But now, standing before that abandoned car, it was as if Rex belonged to another world, one Thomas could neither see nor understand. Sometimes, late at night, Rex would slip from his bed and pad to the front door, growling softly at the dark street beyond. Thomas would wake to the sound of restless pacing, claws clicking against the wooden floor. When he opened the door, Rex would dart out, racing straight toward the car. Even in the stillness of midnight, his barks rang out, waking nearby households. Thomas, a neighbor called one morning, frowning from across the fence, "You better keep that dog under control. Folks are saying he's losing his mind." But Thomas wasn't so sure. He had lived long enough to know that animals saw what humans often ignored. There was something in Rex's eyes, fear, urgency, and determination all at once. It was as if he was trying to tell them all something no one wanted to hear. The whispers grew louder. Some said the car was cursed, others claimed it must hold something dangerous. A few suggested calling the police, but most dismissed the thought. "It's just a dog and an old car," they reasoned, though their voices lacked conviction. Thomas tried to convince himself of the same. Yet each evening, as Rex dragged him toward the rusted vehicle, barking with the desperation of a creature who knew more than he could say, Thomas's doubts grew heavier. He began to wonder, what if Rex was right? What if, behind those grimy windows and rusted doors, Something waited to be found. The town still chose silence. But Rex would not. His restlessness became the drumbeat of unease, a sound that would not fade no matter how much people wished to ignore it. And though no one realized it yet, the shepherd's unshakable instincts were the first warning of a truth that would shake Millbrook to its very core. The days rolled on, and Rex's barking at the abandoned car had become almost routine for the townsfolk. They had grown used to the sound, even though it made their skin prickle with unease. Most adults chose to ignore him, pretending his howls were nothing more than the stubbornness of a restless animal. But children, with their innocent eyes and unclouded hearts, often saw what adults could not. One crisp afternoon, as the autumn leaves rustled along the sidewalks, a little girl in a bright blue dress toddled down the street with her mother. Her name was Lily, a 3-year-old with golden curls and a smile that made strangers pause. Her tiny shoes tapped lightly on the pavement as she held tightly to her mother's hand. She was curious about everything: the falling leaves, the chirping birds, even the cracks in the sidewalk. And when she heard Rex's sharp bark echo across the street, her wide eyes instantly lit with wonder. "Mommy, doggy," she squealed, pointing a small finger toward Rex, who was once again growling and lunging at the rusted car. Her mother gave a tired smile. "Yes, sweetheart, that's Rex. Don't mind him, he's just noisy." But Lily was not so quick to dismiss him. Children, after all, were experts at noticing what adults overlooked. She tugged at her mother's hand, pulling her closer to the edge of the street where Rex barked furiously. His paws scratched against the ground, his body taut like a spring, his eyes burning into the dark crack of the half-open window. The little girl tilted her head, watching him carefully. And then, in the innocent voice only a child could carry, she asked, "Why is he sad? Who is he calling?" The question froze the air around her. A few neighbors who happened to be nearby exchanged uneasy looks. Thomas, struggling to hold Rex's leash, glanced at the child in surprise. No adult had ever framed Rex's behavior that way. They called it madness, nuisance, or stubbornness. But Lily's words pierced deeper. She saw his desperation not as anger, but as sadness. "Sweetheart, stay back," her mother warned quickly, tugging her away from the curb. Her voice shook with a nervous edge she tried to hide. "That car is dirty. Dangerous. Don't go near it." But Lily wasn't convinced. Her innocent eyes never left Rex. She tilted her head again, her curls bouncing as she asked louder, "What's in the car? Why won't he stop?" The adults nearby shuffled uncomfortably. The question lingered, heavy and sharp, because it was the same thought gnawing at them all, the one they tried to bury beneath excuses. Why indeed? What could hold a dog so firmly that he would defy every command, every scolding, every tug of the leash? Rex's barking grew louder, almost as though he was answering the child. His voice cracked with desperation, his body straining forward until Thomas had to plant his cane against the ground just to keep his balance. The shepherd's eyes flickered toward Lily for the briefest moment, as though he recognized her innocence, her willingness to listen when no one else would. Then he snapped his gaze back to the car, barking with renewed fury. "Come along, Lily," her mother urged, pulling her away more firmly this time. Fear made her steps quicker, her grip tighter. She didn't want her daughter anywhere near that rusting shell or the strange tension that clung to it. But Lily looked back over her shoulder, her tiny voice drifting into the heavy silence. "He's trying to tell us something." Her words sank like a stone into the hearts of those who heard them. No one responded. No one dared. Yet their eyes betrayed the truth. They felt it too. Something about Rex's cries carried meaning, and the innocence of a child had made it impossible to ignore. That night, whispers spread through Millbrook. Mothers repeated Lily's words with a shiver in their voices. Men at the cafe shook their heads, their coffee growing cold as they replayed the image of a small girl in a blue dress asking the very question they were too afraid to speak aloud. What's in the car? It was no longer just the dog's restlessness that haunted them, it was the child's innocent voice echoing in their minds. And though her mother had pulled her away, the unease had already spread. The car was no longer just rust and metal. It was a question mark, a shadow over their quiet little town. And Rex, loyal and unyielding, would keep barking until someone finally found the courage to answer it. The storm rolled into Millbrook with a fury no one had expected. All day the sky had hung low and heavy, and by nightfall it broke open with a roar. Rain lashed the streets, pooling in the cracks of the old pavement, while the wind howled down empty alleys, rattling loose shutters and slamming against the worn wooden doors of sleeping homes. Thunder cracked so loudly that windows shook in their frames, and flashes of lightning split the sky into jagged, blinding streaks. It was the kind of night that drove people indoors, pulling curtains shut, locking doors, and praying for the storm to pass quickly. Yet on the far edge of town, where the abandoned car sat hunched in its place like some brooding figure, one voice refused to be drowned out by nature's chaos. Rex stood in front of the car, his fur plastered to his body by the pouring rain, barking with a force that made the storm itself seem weaker. Every cry was raw and desperate, a sound so fierce that it pierced through the roar of thunder and the pounding of rain. He barked, growled, and lunged at the car, his body trembling with urgency as though he could break the metal open with his sheer will. His paws scraped against the ground, splashing water with every frantic movement, while his eyes burned with a determination no storm could extinguish. Thomas struggled behind him, his coat soaked through, his hands nearly numb from gripping the leash that cut painfully into his palm. He shouted at Rex, his voice hoarse from the rain and the wind. "Enough, boy! Come home!" But Rex could not be swayed. He pulled with all the strength in his body, dragging his master toward the car as if his very soul was tethered to it. His barking grew louder, echoing off the houses, until lights began to flicker on one by one. Neighbors peered from their windows, their faces etched with irritation and unease. A few braved the storm long enough to crack open their doors and yell over the wind. "Quiet that dog, Thomas. Has he lost his mind?" Another voice shouted, "It's the middle of the night, for heaven's sake." But their frustration carried no weight against the sound of Rex's cries. It was not madness in his voice, not mere stubbornness, but something deeper, something that unsettled the heart. His barking was a warning, urgent and unrelenting, as if he was trying to shake the whole town awake. The storm grew fiercer, lightning striking so close that the abandoned car was thrown into sharp relief for a fleeting second. Its cracked windshield glistened with rain, its rusted body gleamed like wet stone, and in that brief flash, it looked almost alive. Thunder boomed immediately after, so loud it rattled the very ground, yet Rex's barks rose above it all, defiant, unwilling to surrender to the chaos. And then, in a moment between the thunder's retreat and the rain's relentless pounding, something new broke through. Faint, muffled. It was a cry, so fragile it might have been mistaken for the wind, but Thomas froze, his breath catching in his chest. He leaned closer, straining his ears as his heart hammered against his ribs. Lightning flashed again, and there it was. The sound repeated, clearer this time. It was not the cry of the storm. It was the sound of someone inside the car. Rex erupted with renewed frenzy. His barks turned into howls, his paws clawed desperately at the car door, his entire body shaking with urgency. His eyes glistened with both fury and fear, his muscles straining as though he might tear the rusted metal apart if no one listened. Thomas's hands trembled, the leash slipping slightly as shock coursed through him. He glanced toward the houses, shouting into the storm, "Did you hear that? Somebody heard it? Tell me you heard it." And slowly, people stepped closer to their windows, their irritation replaced by dread. One woman gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "That was a cry," she whispered. Her husband leaned forward, eyes wide. "There's something in there." Another neighbor, who had been cursing Rex only moments earlier, now looked pale as the faint sound carried again through the storm. The car, once dismissed as nothing but rust and ruin, was alive with a presence that none of them had dared imagine. The whispers spread even as the storm raged. Faces pressed to glass, shadows huddled behind doors, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the German shepherd had not been mad at all. He had been right. All along, he had been trying to tell them, and they had ignored him. Now the truth was clawing its way through the silence of their denial. There was something inside that car. Something struggling. Something waiting to be found. Thomas staggered forward, his cane nearly slipping on the wet pavement, his hand reaching for the handle. But the door was rusted shut, refusing to give way beneath his desperate tug. The rain poured harder, the thunder roared again, but nothing could mask the sound of Rex's howls or the faint cries echoing back in answer. The old man turned, his voice breaking as he bellowed into the night, "Call the police! For God's sake, call the police!" And in that moment, Millbrook was no longer a town of whispers and quiet gossip. The storm had dragged its secrets into the open. The abandoned car, ignored for weeks, now pulsed with a truth that could no longer be hidden. Something was inside. Something that would change everything. By the time the storm began to ease, the street outside the abandoned car was already alive with nervous whispers. Curtains fluttered as faces pressed against windows, neighbors huddled under umbrellas, and voices carried through the wet night. Thomas stood helplessly beside Rex, his clothes drenched, his hands trembling as he clutched the leash. He had spent weeks trying to convince himself the dog's barking was nothing but stubbornness. But tonight, as the faint cries from the car repeated again and again, he knew there was no denying it. Something, or someone, was trapped inside. With a shaky hand, he pulled the old phone from his coat pocket and dialed the local police. His voice, broken and urgent, carried fear he could not mask. "You need to come. There's something in that car. My dog, he's been trying to tell us all along." The dispatcher on the other end hesitated. "Sir, are you saying someone is inside the abandoned vehicle?" "I'm saying," Thomas snapped, his voice rising with desperation, "that if you don't get here, someone may die tonight." 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights pierced the darkness of Millbrook's quiet street. A patrol car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the mist and the rain as two officers stepped out. They were men familiar to the townsfolk. Officer Hayes, tall and broad-shouldered with years of service behind him, and Officer Miller, younger, fresh-faced, and far less certain in his movements. Both men carried the same skeptical look as they approached the scene. "What's all this fuss, Thomas?" Hayes asked, shining his flashlight toward the dog. "Your shepherd's been making noise all week. Is this just another wild goose chase?" Rex responded with a bark so fierce it made the younger officer flinch. The dog's body was stiff, his ears pinned back, his teeth bared in a growl that rumbled like thunder itself. He placed his paws against the car door, scratching furiously, his entire body trembling as he refused to break his gaze from the cracked window. His message was clear. There was no mistake. Thomas pointed a trembling finger. "You hear that? You listen close. There's something in there." The officers exchanged a doubtful glance. Miller stepped forward, raising his flashlight and aiming it through the half-open window. The beam of light cut across the damp interior, revealing torn seats, cracked vinyl, and a layer of grime that clung to every surface. At first, it seemed empty, nothing more than a forgotten shell. He turned back with a shrug, but before he could speak, the sound came again. A faint whimper. Fragile. Human. Hayes froze, his jaw tightening. He moved quickly now, shining his own light into the car, pressing his ear against the door. There was another muffled sound, soft but undeniable. He straightened, his face grim. There's something in there. The air shifted instantly. Where there had been doubt, there was now tension so sharp it cut through the night. Neighbors who had gathered under porches gasped audibly, their fear turning into prayers whispered into the storm. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers exchanged uneasy glances, and all eyes locked on the car that had haunted their street for weeks. Rex stood like a soldier, his growls deep and steady, his body blocking anyone from pulling him away. The officers moved closer, but the shepherd did not budge. He pressed himself against the car as if to guard whoever was inside, his instincts telling him that even the rescuers must prove themselves before he allowed them to act. "Easy, boy," Hayes muttered, his voice softer now. "We're here to help." But Rex did not relax. His tail was stiff, his ears forward, his eyes glinting with a wild mix of fear and determination. He had spent too long warning them, too many days barking into silence. Tonight, he would not let anyone ignore the truth. His loyalty bound him to the car, to whatever life still clung inside it, and he was willing to fight the whole world to keep that life safe. The younger officer tried the door handle, tugging hard, but it refused to budge. Rust had fused the metal, sealing the secret inside. "It's stuck," he muttered, glancing nervously at his partner. Hayes nodded. "We'll need tools. Call it in." As Miller hurried back to the patrol car to radio for assistance, Hayes kept his flashlight steady on the window. He caught a flicker of movement, small, fragile, barely visible in the beam. His throat tightened. There's someone in there, and they're alive. The crowd stirred with a collective gasp. Voices rose in disbelief, in horror, in prayers that tumbled into the rain. The abandoned car, once dismissed as nothing more than rust and junk, now pulsed with terrifying significance. Every whisper, every uneasy glance, every bark from Rex had been pointing to this moment. Thomas pressed a shaking hand to his chest, his heart pounding. For weeks he had doubted his dog, scolded him, tried to drag him away. Now, standing in the glow of the patrol car's lights, he realized the truth. Rex had been the only one listening, the only one who had refused to turn away. More sirens echoed in the distance as backup was called in. The storm raged on, but no one noticed anymore. All eyes were on the car, on the German shepherd who stood guard, and on the fragile truth that was about to be pulled into the light. The sound of metal against metal rang out through the stormy night as Officer Hayes and the backup team worked to force open the rusted door of the abandoned car. Each strike of the crowbar sent sparks of fear racing through the hearts of the onlookers. Rain dripped from the trees overhead, pattering against umbrellas and slick coats, yet no one moved away. The entire street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the truth that had been locked inside this forgotten shell of steel for weeks. Rex barked furiously beside the car, his claws digging into the wet ground, his body pressing so close to the door it seemed he might break through it himself. Every growl carried urgency. His amber eyes, glowing in the sweep of the patrol car lights, refused to look away. He knew. He had always known. And tonight he would not stop until the world finally saw what he had been trying to tell them. At last, with a wrenching groan, the door gave way. The rusted hinge snapped, the metal frame screeched, and cold, stale air poured out into the night. It was a smell no one would ever forget, damp, sour, and heavy with the unmistakable trace of human suffering. The crowd recoiled, covering their mouths and noses, while Rex pushed forward, only restrained by Thomas's desperate grip on the leash. His barks grew louder, wilder, as if urging the officers to look deeper, to not hesitate. Hayes raised his flashlight and peered inside. The beam cut through shadows that clung stubbornly to the car's filthy interior. What he saw first made his chest tighten. Long, jagged scratches covered the upholstery on the back seat, deep, frantic marks carved into the fabric and foam. Some ran down the metal frame itself, desperate grooves of fingernails dragged in terror. It was proof that someone had fought, someone had struggled, someone had tried to escape. "Dear God," Hayes whispered under his breath, his voice trembling despite years of hardened service. The younger officer leaned in, his hand gripping the car door for balance. "Those are the scratch marks. From hands." His voice cracked on the last word, his eyes wide. The neighbors pressed closer now, fear rising in their throats. Mothers clutched their children to their sides. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief, and whispers broke out like a ripple of dread. But before anyone could say more, a sound drifted up from the dark interior, a whimper. So fragile, but unmistakably alive. Rex went wild, leaping toward the open door, barking with such force it echoed off the houses. His tail stood stiff, his ears pinned forward, his entire body straining with urgency. Thomas's knuckles turned white as he tried to hold him back, but even he knew his dog was right. Hayes shoved his flashlight deeper inside, his beam sweeping under the torn back seat. And then he saw it, movement. Small, trembling movement. His breath caught. Beneath the seat, pressed into the shadows as if trying to disappear from the world, was a puppy. Its fur was matted with dirt, its ribs showing with every shaky breath. The little creature whimpered again, curling into itself, too weak even to stand. "Oh Lord," Hayes muttered, his throat tight. "There's a puppy in here." The crowd gasped, but before their shock could settle, Hayes froze. His flashlight beam shifted, catching something more, a shape beside the puppy. At first, it was still lifeless. But then it moved just barely. A hand. A frail, trembling hand. Hayes's heart stopped. There's a child." Gasps turned into cries. Neighbors pressed forward, some covering their mouths, some calling out prayers into the storm. The officers scrambled, reaching in, trying to free the frail body from the shadows. The sight that emerged silenced the entire street. A little girl, no older than 6, was wedged against the seat, her small frame curled protectively around the weak puppy. Her skin was pale, almost gray, her lips dry and cracked. She was barefoot, her blue dress torn and dirty, her hair tangled into knots. She clutched the puppy against her chest as though it was the only thing keeping her alive. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, every breath a struggle. She blinked slowly against the light, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, but she was alive. Barely alive. The entire crowd seemed to collapse into tears all at once. Some cried openly, others fell silent, hands pressed to their faces. Thomas dropped to his knees, his body trembling as he looked at Rex, whose barks had now turned into deep, desperate whines. The shepherd pawed at the ground, his eyes locked on the girl and the puppy, his body shaking with a mix of urgency and relief. He had found them. He had never stopped. Hayes's voice cracked as he shouted, "Medic! Get blankets! Get help now!" The younger officer pulled his jacket off and wrapped it around the girl, his own hands shaking as he lifted her gently out of the car. She was light, too light, as though the weeks had stripped her of all but skin and bone. Still, even in her weakness, she did not let go of the puppy. Her fingers clung to its fur with the stubbornness of survival. As she was lifted into the arms of safety, a soft sound escaped her cracked lips. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was a whisper. "Doggy." Her eyes shifted toward Rex, who now pressed forward, his body trembling as his leash was finally let loose. He padded closer, slowly, carefully, his head low, his tail still. He sniffed her gently, then licked her dirt-stained hand with the tenderness of a guardian reunited with the life he had fought to save. The street broke into sobs. Hardened men wiped at their eyes, women clutched their hearts, and children whispered questions they didn't understand. The storm rumbled above, but down below, something brighter stirred, hope, raw and fragile, but alive. Hayes looked at Thomas with eyes that held both disbelief and admiration. "If not for this dog," he said hoarsely, "we never would have looked. We never would have known." Thomas dropped his gaze to Rex, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He knew. He knew all along. And above it all, Rex sat proudly beside the girl, his chest rising and falling with the strength of a hero. He had barked, he had refused to give up, and now his purpose was clear. He had saved a life. The night had turned heavier than ever, the storm clouds pressing low over the small town as though the heavens themselves leaned down to watch. The moment the little girl's frail body was pulled from the rusted car, time seemed to stop. For one long breath, nobody moved. The crowd stood frozen under the yellow glow of street lamps, their raincoats dripping, their hands clutching one another, their eyes fixed on the dirt-streaked face of a child who had no business being alive in that place. Then everything erupted at once, sirens wailing, orders being shouted, neighbors crying out, and the steady, desperate voice of Officer Hayes calling for paramedics to move faster. 2 paramedics rushed forward, their red bags bouncing against their sides, the reflective stripes on their jackets flashing in the headlights of the patrol cars. One dropped to his knees beside the child, pulling open his kit, while the other spread a thick blanket across the wet pavement. The little girl was laid gently down, her thin chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Mud smeared across her arms and legs, her hair matted into knots, and yet she clutched the weak puppy with a grip so firm it seemed as though nothing could pry it away. "She's alive," the first paramedic announced, his voice trembling even though he was trained for moments like this. "Weak pulse, shallow breathing. We need oxygen now." His partner handed him a mask, and they slipped it gently over her nose and mouth, the hiss of oxygen breaking through the stunned silence. The girl's tiny chest shuddered, then lifted a little higher, her body fighting its way back to life. A ripple of relief moved through the crowd, but no one dared cheer. Tears rolled silently down hardened faces instead. Fathers who had seen war, mothers who had buried loved ones, children who didn't fully understand but felt the weight of the moment pressing against their small hearts. Rex barked once more, sharp and commanding, as though urging them all not to waste time. He sat beside her, his body tense, his head lowered near her shoulder, watching every move the strangers made. When the paramedic tried to loosen her fingers from the puppy, Rex gave a low growl, protective and firm. Thomas stepped forward quickly, crouching beside his dog. "Easy, boy. They're helping her. They'll take care of both of them." His voice cracked with pride and exhaustion, and somehow Rex seemed to understand. His growl faded into a whimper, and he lowered his head against the child's side, licking her hand gently as the mask continued to pump life into her fragile body. By now, the entire town had gathered, spilling out from their porches, huddling under umbrellas, some barefoot in the rain. Prayers slipped from trembling lips, whispers of gratitude, pleas for healing, promises of faith renewed. An elderly woman clasped her rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. A teenage boy who had once mocked Rex for barking too much now stood with tears streaking his face, his hands clenched at his sides. Every single heart on that street beat for the same fragile life that lay on the blanket. The paramedics worked quickly, slipping in 4 into her tiny arm, wrapping her in layers of warmth, checking her vitals with hands that trembled despite their training. "We need to transport her immediately," one said, his tone urgent. "She's stable enough to move, but barely." The stretcher was unfolded with a metallic click, its wheels squeaking as it touched the ground. The girl was lifted carefully, her body no heavier than a bundle of blankets, the puppy still pressed against her chest. She stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering, and for the first time, a weak sound slipped through the mask. It was a whisper, muffled but clear. "Doggy!" Gasps broke out among the crowd, followed by sobs so raw they seemed to shake the rain itself. Hardened police officers, men who had seen death and tragedy countless times, turned their faces away, blinking hard against the tears. Officer Hayes covered his mouth with his hand, his shoulders trembling as he whispered, "She's fighting." Even the fire chief, a man known for his stern, unyielding presence, wiped at his eyes as though he couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. The stretcher wheels rolled slowly, carefully, toward the waiting ambulance, its red light spinning against the wet street like a beacon of fragile hope. The doors opened wide, the interior glowing with sterile light, a strange kind of salvation in the middle of so much darkness. The paramedics climbed inside, lifting the stretcher gently, their voices calm but urgent as they continued to monitor her. The puppy whimpered once, its head resting against the girl's chest, and one paramedic allowed it to remain. "Let it stay," he said softly. "It might be the only thing keeping her calm." Rex tried to climb in after her, his body pressing toward the ambulance, his bark sharp with desperation. Thomas struggled to hold him back, but his own tears betrayed the fight in his heart. "He doesn't want to leave her," Thomas choked. "He found her. He saved her. Please." For a long moment, the paramedic hesitated, glancing at the officer in charge. Hayes gave a small nod, his voice hoarse. "Let the dog ride with her. He's earned it." And so, for the first time anyone could remember, a German shepherd was lifted into the back of an ambulance, settling himself at the side of a child he had refused to abandon. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and with a wail of sirens, it sped off into the night, carrying hope through the rain. The crowd stood in silence long after it had gone, their faces wet with both rain and tears, their hearts heavy yet lifted by the miracle they had just witnessed. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others hugged each other fiercely, whispering words of thanks, of disbelief, of awe. The old abandoned car, once nothing more than a rusting shadow on their street, had become the center of a story that none of them would ever forget. And through it all, one truth settled deeply in every soul that stood there. Without Rex, without his relentless barking, without his refusal to be ignored, the girl and the puppy would have been lost forever. He had been the voice for the voiceless, the guardian who sensed what no one else could, the hero who refused to give up. The ambulance raced through the rain-slicked streets, its siren echoing across the quiet town like a cry for hope. Inside, the little girl lay motionless on the stretcher, her chest rising only because of the oxygen mask pressed gently over her face. Her tiny hand, still clutching the weak puppy, rested against the blanket. Beside her, Rex sat alert, his ears pinned back, his dark eyes locked on her pale face. Every time her chest rose, he leaned forward slightly, as if counting each fragile breath. The paramedics exchanged looks of disbelief but made no attempt to move him. It was as though they understood that this dog was not a passenger. He was a guardian, and his place was exactly there. When they reached the hospital, the emergency doors burst open, spilling white light into the stormy night. Doctors and nurses rushed forward, wheeling the stretcher into the building. Rex leapt down gracefully, never letting the girl out of his sight, padding alongside as though he belonged to the team. No one stopped him. No one dared. His loyalty was too fierce, too pure. Even the head nurse whispered, "Let him stay. He's part of this." Inside the pediatric ward, chaos met urgency. Machines beeped, monitors flashed, and gloved hands moved swiftly, checking vitals, warming her body, stabilizing her fragile condition. The puppy was carefully lifted and wrapped in a small towel, A veterinarian called in to check its condition. It whimpered but wagged its tail faintly, proof that it too would survive. Rex pressed his muzzle against the girl's hand, licking gently, as if reminding her she was not alone. Nurses worked around him, stepping carefully, and one young doctor shook his head in amazement. "If not for this dog," he murmured to a colleague, "we'd never have looked inside that car. We would have lost them both." The hours that followed stretched long and heavy. Townsfolk gathered outside the hospital, some still in their nightclothes, refusing to leave until they heard news. Police officers stood near the doors, drenched uniforms clinging to their bodies, eyes weary but hopeful. They replayed the night's events in their minds, shaken by how close they had come to overlooking the abandoned car. Officer Hayes finally broke the silence. "If not for Rex," he admitted softly, "we'd have walked right past. We all thought it was nothing. But he knew. He always knew." His words spread like wildfire, whispered among the crowd, turning skepticism into awe. In the waiting room, Thomas sat hunched over, his hands folded tightly, his face lined with both fear and pride. Beside him, Rex lay stretched out on the cold tile floor, his eyes never leaving the door where the doctors worked. Occasionally he let out a low whimper, his ears twitching at every sound. He looked worn from the hours of barking and the storm, but his loyalty was unbroken. He would not leave, not until he knew she was safe. And in that silence, the people waiting began to see the dog differently. He was not just a German shepherd barking at shadows. He was the reason a child still had a chance to breathe. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors opened. A doctor stepped out, his mask lowered, his expression tired but hopeful. "She's stable," he announced. A wave of relief swept through the crowd. Cries of joy, prayers whispered louder, tears streaming down faces. Mothers clutched their children closer. Neighbors embraced. Even hardened men bowed their heads, overcome with emotion. The doctor continued. "She was malnourished, dehydrated, and weak, but thanks to the immediate rescue, she is alive. She will recover." Rex barked once, sharp and strong, as though he understood. He rose to his feet and pressed forward, nudging open the swinging doors until he reached the child's bedside once again. The girl lay wrapped in clean blankets, her cheeks faintly flushed now with warmth, her hair brushed gently aside. The puppy rested in a small basket beside her, its breathing steadier. When Rex approached, the girl's small fingers twitched, and with the faintest movement, she curled them around his fur. A soft sigh escaped her lips, the kind of sound that carried more power than words. It was a sound of trust, of comfort, of survival. Doctors and nurses paused in their work, quietly moved by the sight. No medical training could explain the bond unfolding before them. This was loyalty in its purest form, a love that had barked against storms, scratched against steel, and refused to give up when everyone else had turned away. One nurse wiped at her eyes and whispered, "He saved her in every way that matters." Word of the rescue spread quickly through the town and beyond. Newspapers called it a miracle. Radio stations spoke of the hero dog. People from nearby towns drove hours just to stand outside the hospital, leaving flowers, blankets, and toys for the little girl. But the true hero, they said, was Rex, the German shepherd who refused to be ignored. His photograph, standing guard beside the hospital bed, made its way across newspapers and television screens. Yet for Rex, none of that mattered. His world was small and simple. The child was alive, the puppy was safe, and he had done his duty. In the following days, as the girl's strength returned and her cheeks regained color, Rex remained by her side. He followed the nurses as they checked her vitals, rested at the foot of her bed when she slept, and perked his ears every time she stirred. When she finally opened her eyes and whispered her first words, They weren't to the doctors or her mother who now sat crying at her side. They were to Rex. "Good doggy." Her weak smile, faint but real, lit the room brighter than the morning sun. The police returned often, standing by her door, each time reminding themselves what they had almost missed. "If not for this dog," they repeated, "we'd have never checked. We'd have walked away." Their voices carried both guilt and gratitude, but more than that, respect. Rex had seen what none of them could. He had been the voice that broke the silence, the strength that saved two innocent lives. And so, Rex became more than just a loyal pet. He became a symbol of what it meant to love without condition, to fight without reason, to protect without thought of recognition. In every whispered prayer, in every grateful glance, his name carried weight. He had turned an abandoned car into a place of miracles, a night of storms into a night of salvation. In the weeks that followed, the town could not stop talking about the night the abandoned car became the center of a miracle. For years, people had passed that rusted shell without a second glance, treating it as nothing more than scrap metal left to decay on the edge of their quiet streets. Yet now, when anyone walked by, they slowed down, their eyes lingering on the place that once held despair but now carried hope. The whispers that once mocked Rex, calling him restless or mad, had turned into gentle voices of respect. Parents held their children tighter, neighbors greeted one another with softer hearts, and the old car that once seemed forgotten was no longer just a heap of metal. It was a symbol, a reminder that life can hide in the most unexpected shadows, waiting for loyalty and innocence to reveal it. The little girl who had been rescued slowly began to heal, both in body and spirit. She was fragile at first, her steps uncertain, her breaths shallow, but each day brought a new spark of strength. Nurses spoke in awe of her resilience, saying she had survived not just because of medicine but because someone had fought for her long before she ever reached the hospital. That someone was Rex. Even as the machines beeped and the doctors worked, it was the dog who never left her side, the dog who pressed his warm muzzle against her hand when she cried in her sleep, the dog who refused to let her drift back into the darkness she had escaped. And as her strength returned, so too did her smile. One afternoon, when the sun poured softly through the hospital window, she sat up in bed for the first time, reached out her small hand, and whispered, "Rex." It was not just a word. It was a bond, spoken in the simplest language of trust, the kind of trust only children and loyal dogs truly understand. The bond between them deepened with every passing day. The puppy that had been found with her grew stronger as well, tumbling clumsily at her feet, yelping happily whenever Rex barked softly. The three became inseparable, a living picture of survival and new beginnings. Where once the girl had cried out in weakness, now her laughter returned, echoing in the hospital halls like a song no one had expected to hear again. Doctors and nurses paused in their work just to listen. Hardened police officers who had seen tragedy too many times found their eyes softening when they saw her lean against Rex's fur, whispering secrets in his ear, as though the dog was the only one who could understand her heart. The town, too, found healing through this story. People who had once dismissed the shepherd's cries now admitted their mistake. They gathered in church pews and front porches, speaking of what had happened not as gossip, but as testimony. Sometimes, one elderly woman said, "It takes the purest instincts to uncover what our eyes cannot see." Her words spread through the community, reminding everyone that miracles often come not with trumpets or thunder, but with the simple bark of a faithful heart refusing to be silenced. The abandoned car, once a mark of neglect, became a landmark of remembrance. Flowers were laid beside it. Children left small drawings taped to its doors, pictures of Rex, of the rescued girl, of a puppy drawn with crayons and smiling suns. It was no longer a forgotten object. It was a memorial of life saved, of truth revealed, Of the night innocence had spoken louder than doubt. For Rex, life changed as well. He was no longer seen as just a family pet. He became a guardian, a hero, a symbol of loyalty so fierce it had broken through walls of ignorance. Everywhere he walked, people greeted him, patting his head, calling his name with gratitude in their voices. Yet Rex himself seemed unchanged. He did not seek attention or glory. His eyes still searched the streets, his ears still perked at every sound, his body still ready to protect. His loyalty was not for the crowd but for the child he had saved. To her he belonged. To her he was more than a hero, he was family. And the child, still young but wise in the way only survivors can be, carried that bond like a light. She followed Rex everywhere, her tiny footsteps beside his steady paws. She spoke to him as though he could answer, and in his eyes there was always a response. When she laughed, he wagged his tail. When she grew tired, he lay beside her, his warmth steady and comforting. The town began to see them as one, dog and child, survivor and savior, a story that reminded them of the truths they often forgot. That love does not always speak in words, that innocence can see what wisdom overlooks, that loyalty can break through darkness when all else fails. As time passed, the story spread beyond the borders of the town. Newspapers wrote of the hero shepherd, and television stations carried images of Rex sitting proudly by the little girl's side. Letters came from strangers across the country, prayers, gifts, and simple notes that said, "Thank you for reminding us what love looks like." Some called it a miracle, others called it fate. But those who had been there, who had stood in the rain that night and heard Rex's cries pierce the storm, knew the truth was even simpler. It had been loyalty. Nothing more, nothing less. The dog had refused to give up, and in that refusal he had saved 2 lives and awakened a town. Sometimes the world hides its greatest truths in silence. We walk past them, too busy or too blind to notice. Yet loyalty and innocence do not stay silent. They cry out, they bark, they reach for us with small hands and pure hearts until we are forced to stop, to see, to understand. The abandoned car, once nothing more than rust and decay, had become the stage for such a revelation. A stage where a loyal shepherd, a fragile child, and a forgotten puppy taught an entire town that miracles are not found in grand gestures, but in the instincts of love that refuse to be ignored. And so, the car remained, not destroyed, not removed, but honored. A plaque was placed beside it with words simple yet eternal. Here, loyalty saved innocence. Here, a bark became a miracle. Visitors came, children pointed, and the story lived on. But for those who truly knew it, the real story was not in the car or even in the town. It was in the bond that formed between a little girl and her dog. For in her eyes, he was not just a hero. He was her friend, her protector, her family. In the end, the lesson was clear. The town had learned it, the officers had learned it, and anyone who heard the story could not deny it. Sometimes miracles are uncovered not by strength or reason, but by the voices we are too quick to dismiss. Sometimes it takes the bark of a dog, the curiosity of a child, or the love of a heart too loyal to give up, to remind us that kindness still breathes in this world, and that hope is never truly lost. And so, in the end, the story of the abandoned car was never just about rusted doors or broken glass. It was about a German shepherd who refused to give up, about the way loyalty can pierce through silence when human eyes and ears fail to see the truth. It was about a fragile child who survived because a dog's heart was too faithful to be ignored, and a town that discovered miracles can bloom even in forgotten corners. This was not just a rescue. This was a reminder that love and loyalty, in their purest forms, shine even in the darkest places where hope seems lost. Think about it for a moment. How many times have we walked past something unusual, brushed off a sound, or ignored a feeling in our gut? How many times has the world tried to tell us something through small signs that we failed to notice? Dogs, in their innocence, do not ignore those signals. They sense danger, they sense sorrow, and sometimes they sense miracles waiting to be uncovered. Rex's bark was not just noise, it was truth breaking through the silence. It was a cry for help, a call for attention, a voice that said, "Don't look away. Someone needs you." And maybe that is the heart of this story, not just what was discovered inside that car, but what it awakened in all of us. A reminder that we are not meant to live with eyes closed or hearts hardened. That sometimes the smallest voices, whether of a loyal dog or an innocent child, reveal the truths that save lives. We only have to listen. So, dear listener, let me ask you, do you believe animals sense what we cannot? Do you believe that loyalty and love give them sight where we see only shadows? If you do, then perhaps you also believe what this town now knows, that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four legs, guided not by duty or reason, but by love so pure it refuses to be silenced. The people of that town will never forget Rex. They will never forget the sound of his bark tearing through the storm, or the sight of him standing guard until the truth was revealed. And the little girl he saved will carry him in her heart forever, not just as a dog, but as a guardian who gave her back her life. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Share it with someone who may have forgotten what loyalty looks like, or someone who needs to be reminded that hope is never too far gone. Because stories like this do more than tell us about a single dog or a single child. They remind us of the power of love, the courage of innocence, and the miracles waiting quietly in the corners of our lives. As you turn away from this tale tonight, carry with you the truth it leaves behind. Loyalty saves, love heals, and sometimes a bark in the night is the only voice we need to lead us back to hope.